Hello everyone, this is Axel Paxel back with another tutorial for how to paint the freehand tentacles on the Sunstalker from Kingdom Death Monster. As you can see, I have already painted the eye freehand. That video is exclusive to Patreons. If you want to see how I painted that eye, you uh, have to click the link in the description and become a patron. I don't know if you caught that, but I accidentally dropped my mixing brush there, so it mixed with the top portion of my wet palette. All right, so right now I'm painting up or I'm mixing up the color for the base color that goes around the eye. This is a mix of dark sea blue and model color turquoise, both from Vallejo. I also added a little bit of water to thin the paint up. I'm going to go over this area with other layers as well. So if I were to paint this too thickly, I would create texture on the model, and I don't want that, so I thin it down slightly with water. So as you can see, this part here is actually quite straightforward. You just paint in your eye. You have to do this before you paint the freehand, because going into all the crevices and working around the freehand will be more difficult later. So that's why you should put down the base color first. Yeah. Like you can see here, I didn't do that with the eye, so now I have to go over the fine lines all around the eye, and yeah, that takes time. So if you can avoid that, then put down the base color first, and then do your freehand on top of that. This is going to be a rather long video, but I would stay tuned, because you can actually learn quite a bit about how to make objects seem a little bit more three-dimensional, even though they aren't, through the use of highlights and shadows. And even if you don't actually paint the tentacles yourself on the model you are doing, you will still learn something which you can apply in some other ways on your own model. I wanted to create tentacles on this model because I think it would look cool with the tentacles coming out from underneath the eye, and yeah, twirling around as if it's coming out of his belly almost. So now that we have gotten the base color down around the eye, it's time for us to mix the color for the tentacles. Now I have a model color purple here put down on the palette. If I were to paint straight up with this without mixing in any other colors, the tentacles would look very too saturated, and it's not a nice color. So I have to tone that that saturation down in order for the veins, no, the tentacles to look a little bit more like, uh, make them look almost less cartoony. Yeah. So now I'm adding some Yriel yellow to the wet palette. So now we're ready to start mixing the color for the tentacles. If you have a color in your paint cabinet that fits perfect, you don't have to mix, of course. I have to mix because I don't have the right color for tentacles, so I just have to play around with it. Okay, so now I'm adding a little bit of black, purple, and yellow, and I'm going back into the mixes in order to get the desired color that I want. You can of course mix your own color. It's no problem. You can use green or yeah. And be sure to add a little bit of water. My water glass is directly over the wet palette. Unfortunately, you cannot see it, but whenever you see my brush going on top of the on the wet palette, I'm likely adding water or putting the brush in water. So now I'm creating a highlight color. I created the highlight color by just using the mixed color that I've already used, and added a little bit more yellow and a little bit more white. I like to also add a little bit color to the highlight color, because if you're only using white, you are only desaturating the color, and that can look a little bit artificial. So here I've added a third color, a little bit of a jump there. The third mix you can see on the top right corner is basically the same mixture. I'm just adding more white to it for the highest highlight points. You can see that I've already painted 3 tentacles already. I wanted to test those colors before I fully committed to them, and I was satisfied. So you will now see me paint the other tentacles. The eye itself looks very flat right now because I haven't added highlights on top and no shadows to the tentacles, and there needs to be both tentacles above and under. So when you do freehand work like this, it's important that you don't get discouraged because it's not moving quickly enough to in the direction you want it to. Keep in mind that getting there takes a little bit of time. So if you keep working on the same area and try to progress it in your mind as to where you want it to go, it tends to become rather nice in the end. But like I said in a previous video, when you do freehand work like this, 95% of the time that you are working on it, it's going to look like crap. It's not until the final moments, like in the last 5%, where you can really see it coming together. So just stay with it. Don't give up. Like I said, if you want to, in the beginning of the video, if you want to see how I created the eye itself, be sure to click the link in the description and you're taken directly to my Patreon page. And if you're lucky, there are 2 more spots left for the first 10 patrons. That means that for a $1 pledge, you get access to all my exclusive patron content, my exclusive videos. After that tier fills up, there are only 2 spots left of the first 10. I'm going to release a new tier, which will begin at $3. So it's not a lot, actually. It's cheaper than most others in the miniature painting business that are on Patreon. But I want to create a community where we get together and I give advice and people help each other, and yeah. So I want to have many instead of like a few that contribute a lot, if that makes sense. Okay, so going back to the miniature itself, I'm trying to get the tentacle into the shape I actually want it to look like. And this too is a little bit of a back and forth process, because sometimes I will make some curves that I do not like, and I will paint over it. That's no problem, because you can always go back and correct it with your base color. It's still on the palette there. That's the blue mixture in the middle. So I think I'm going to do that here, actually. Yeah. So I wasn't satisfied with that juncture in the tentacle there. Just thought it looked a little bit weird, a little bit off. And here I'm I'm going. I can almost hear myself thinking. Here I'm going over in my mind if I should do this tentacle in another matter, because I feel that something is off on it. So so whenever you see me looking at the model and not painting, that's when I'm thinking about how to progress, and that's an important part of painting freehand as well, because if you work too fast, you're gonna get results that you do not like. I guess you could like draw it if you're a good drawer. You could draw it on a piece of paper or something in advance, but I don't do that. I tend to look at some reference images that I find online. Like in this example, I for the eye, I searched for eyes basically, and for tentacles, I searched for tentacles. Having a reference image actually helps a lot. because then you don't have to draw it like completely from your mind. So now I'm starting to apply the one of the highlights, not the highest highlight, and I'm painting near the middle part of the tentacle, and this will give it a slightly elevated look, like it's almost like more three-dimensional, because if you only paint a tentacle in one color, it's going to appear very flat. Keep in mind that the paint that I'm doing this with is a layer paint. If you were to do this with a paint that it has too thick consistency, it's not going to look nice, because it's going to create a hard transition between the highlight and the color of the tentacle under it. So now I'm applying the second highlight, which is a little bit more brighter. And I'm adding this in spots that's going to be more in light. And that is in particularly when it goes over the other tentacle that's underneath it. So that part there, right where I had my brush there, is going to catch more light compared to the other parts of the vein. And since that part is the part that I tend to want to be more highlighted, I try to end my brush stroke on that place, because you will always leave the most paint where your brush is leaving the model. So now it's starting to already look a bit better. Here I'm applying even a little bit brighter highlight from the mixture you saw me put on before. You can also see me painting some dots. Actually, I should have used a little bit thicker paint for that particular purpose, because adding such dots will add some interest to the tentacles, and it's going to create more of a focal point for those. Here I'm going over in my mind. I'm not actually painting on the model at all. I'm going over in my mind where I want the next tentacle to be. And when you start to paint over already done tentacles, you got to be a little bit careful, because obviously if you're not satisfied with the tentacle you are putting on top of it, it's not impossible to go back, but then you ruin the tentacle that's underneath it. So yeah. So that's why I'm not painting this portion as fast as the other as the first three tentacles. When I paint miniatures in general, I tend to always try my best. So the result that you see is often at the peak of my capacity, if you will. I find it that I'm growing the most as a painter when I push myself and constantly push myself. Yeah, I may spend more time than in doing something new, but if you always push yourself, you're going to advance your painting as well. If you were to rely on the same techniques, the same models, even if you were painting an army and paint the same miniatures, for instance, you're of course going to have some progress in your painting, but I think it would be higher if you were to constantly challenge yourself into doing new things. So as you can see here, I'm this tentacle right now looks a bit of a mess. That's because I'm trying to get the outline just right. And actually, this is one of the tentacles that I think turned out the best. So it's kind of interesting for me to watch it now and see how terrible it looks and how it will end up. So here I'm just filling in the tentacle with base color for the tentacles. I think I really hit that curve quite well. Actually, I should mention that I'm also going to be releasing other tutorials from this same model. I'm going to do a tutorial on how to do highlights, which will be more theme based. There are basically, well, I know of 3 ways in which you can do highlights, and I will try to show where and when to use each one. And I think that's actually one of the questions that people tend to ask me the most about, how I do highlights. And obviously on spots like this, like on tentacles, you can learn some from this, but how were you to, for instance, do highlights on the tentacles on the legs, for instance, those long legs that he has, and I will go into that. So yeah, should be released sometime next week, I think. So using the same logic, this vein that I'm painting right now is going to be brightest at the junction where it goes over the other vein, and that will give it a more three-dimensional look, because it curves over the other. So using that logic, I will add highlights that are strongest at that point where it crosses the other tentacle. Actually, as I'm recording this, I can see that I got a new patron supporter, which is quite nice. So now there's only one spot left for the first 10 supporters. So yeah, if you're listening to this message and you want to have access to all my patron exclusive tutorials as well, you can grab that last spot for $1 monthly. If not, then you can still have access to those tutorials for $3 monthly, which is still a lot cheaper than almost every other painter out there. But for me, it's about trying to create a painting community in which we support one another, give each other advice, and I'm mostly doing this for the sake of painting and for the sake of teaching others. But of course, creating the tutorials that I create takes a great deal of time. And in order for me to justify, for instance, having 1 day a month where I actually am at home and create videos and I paint, I have to create some income from that as well. Having 2 kids is is expensive. So yeah, I'm actually very satisfied with the way that that final Wayne tentacle turned out. I think it looks pretty awesome. I should call out actually my newest Patreon supporter, Andre Correa. Thank you so much for becoming one of my patrons. It means a lot to me. So going back to the video, now I'm mixing a glaze. This glaze is important. It's very dark. It's a mixture of model color black and a dark sea blue. You need to add quite a bit of water to this this paint because it's very easy to leave paint brush marks when you paint with such a dark color. So what you're in essence doing now is applying shadows to the tentacles. And it's actually quite interesting when you look at highlights, and a lot of people ask me how to do highlights. You can't do highlights without also addressing shadows, because your highlights will appear more highlighted if you correctly do your shadows. And in this case, for the tentacles, they will also help in creating a three-dimensional feel to the tentacles. because as they are elevated from the body, the stomach, which is the effect I want to give, they are going to create shadows where they are not directly over the or lining up near the stomach. So you need to add these shadows. It's very important. Without them, it does not look that good, to be honest. So you can see that I also wipe off some of the paint, which is very important to do when you're working with glazes. Because if you don't, you will flood an area with paint, and it will not look nice, and you will create all sorts of problems. So yeah, create your glaze. Have a lot of water in it. Like this is perhaps 5 parts water, 1 part paint. Stick your brush in it, and it's you can see the brush I'm actually using. It's not a dirty old brush, but it's a brush that has lost its tip. And for this particular line of detail work, where you work with glazes, it's better to use a brush that has lost its tip. So this is that's why I'm using this brush here. And the reason for these brushes working better is that you have more hair that's hitting the model at the same time, whereas if you have a very fine tip, you only have one or a few hair, which tend to cause paint lines. Yeah. So now I'm applying some more shadows. I want it to appear like the tentacles are coming from underneath the eye, so I need to soften or I mean blur where along the edge of where the tentacles are coming from. You can also see me that I test the glaze on top of my fingernail before I apply it. I usually test glazes on my fingernail and not my skin, because on your fingernail you should be able to see more easily if it's transparent or not. So when you're testing your glaze, if you are making a mark on your fingernail that is totally obscures the fingernail, you're not working with a glaze. It's thicker, so you need to dilute it further with water, and the result that you want is when you have your fingernail and you can almost barely see a mark. Okay, so here's a little bit of a time jump. Here you can see that I've already added some highlights. I think I will include this in my tutorial for how to do highlights. But since this video is focusing on the tentacles, I decided to keep them separate. So now I'm since I already added the highlight here, I gotta be a little bit careful with where I put my tentacles, because it's a smooth gradient transition between blue and more whitish blue greenish, and if you make mistakes here, you have to redo the highlight, which of course is possible. It's no problem, you can do that, but it takes time, so it's better to get it right the first time around. The only way you can actually like destroy a model, or even then you can actually fix it, is if you paint with paint that's too thick. But even then you can use your fingernail and scrape off paint. So yeah, you can always, or almost always, go back. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, but don't get mad if you do. I sometimes get a little bit mad, and I start making mistakes. And when you make one mistake, you make more mistakes, and then you end up with a result that's not as nice as it could have been. So here you can actually see that I'm working with a bit of texture in the model itself. Before I actually painted on this eye hair, I prepared the model for the freehand work by sanding it down. Sanding down basically details texture in the model. But I didn't go as high as the area I'm painting now. So now I have to paint freehand on top of texture. That's more difficult to do because if you're not careful, it will look kind of weird when you take a close look at it, because you can see that it has texture, and it's just weird that like there's something on top of that. So yeah, you can try to make the texture work in your favor, but yeah, it's harder to do. So it's better to sand it down properly before you paint. It's too late for that now, of course. So I just keep on going. I think it will still look quite nice. So, but I am aware of this as I'm painting this. So here I'm contemplating how I want to paint this this tentacle, and this tentacle is a little bit more high risk compared to the other tentacles, because I want this tentacle to slightly go over the eye, and I really do not want to destroy the eye in any way, shape, or form. So I got to be very careful with how I put this this down, and that's why I spent quite a little bit of time here not painting. I'm actually contemplating how I should progress in painting this this tentacle. I end up with a result that's I would call it okay plus. There's definitely room for improvement on this tentacle. But yeah, it is what it is. Not everything can be perfect. So yeah, if you try to get everything perfect at all junctures when doing freehand work, I think it's quite possible to go insane. So yeah, at one point you have to take a step back and say that you could have done that differently, and maybe next time you will do it better. I think I still end up with a result that's okay, but yeah, definitely room for improvement. The highlight could be a lot smoother on the belly. I threw together that quite fast actually. That highlight. I think I spent maybe 4 minutes on it, maybe. Maybe more actually. Time always. I'm sure you guys can relate to that. Time flies very quickly when you start to sit down and start painting. Yeah. So here I realized that I actually don't want. I don't want that. I don't want such a small tentacle, so I have to extend it, and I extend it by trying to work around the lines that I've already created. Having one of the tentacles go over the eye as well will help with the tentacles themselves looking as more three-dimensional. So right now, I think it looks those two veins look a little bit wonky because one is kind of thick where it starts to go from underneath the eye, whereas the other was quite um, thin. So that's why I'm correcting for this now and creating it a little bit thicker where it extends from underneath the eye. Looking at it at this distance, you can see the texture that I'm actually painting over. These bits will become less apparent when I add the highlights, but if you study them, you will still be able to see them. So here I decided to extend the tentacle a little bit. The tentacle itself is not as sharp as it should be here, so I'm trying to correct for that. The other tentacles are quite pointy at the end, so it would look weird with one of the tentacles not being that in that form. And as you can see, there's actually one blood vein that is almost of the same color that's directly underneath the that tentacle. So I will have to go over with a light or bright glaze to tone that vein down. So here I'm adding the final two tentacles, one on each side of the eye. The eye is starting to look, or this part of the model is starting to look a little bit more interesting now. As you can see, it's starting to come together because I've added the shadow underneath the belly, and also the highlight on top of the belly. And with the freehand going over it, it's really starting to come together. But you have to remember that getting to this spot involves actually completing a lot of different partial steps. Like it's not done in an instance. So I think it took some hours getting here actually. You can still see some textures in the model in other spots on the model as well. Trying to decide where I want the next tentacle to go and how I want it to go. Just creating the outline. This particular tentacle is my least favorite one. It turned out too thick, and it got very hard to work with and put the highlights on. Yeah. So here I'm just filling in with the the same color, filling in the vein. And yeah, as you can see, there are a lot of texture in the model here. There are a lot of like small lines, as you can see, and those actually make it quite difficult to pull off any highlight that will seem realistic, actually. Because as you're going over with highlights, you're gonna catch these heightened bit in the model, and it will just look a little bit off. But having one or maybe two veins that look a little off is no big issue, because there are so much other parts that catch the interest of the viewer. So it's not a huge issue. Whereas if you had those veins like the one I'm painting now all over the model, it would look very weird. The more details you actually put down on a model, the less visible small mistakes will become visible, if that makes sense. So it's a way to obscure mistakes, actually, by putting on more details. So here I'm starting the highlight work, and as you can see already, I'm having a little bit of a struggle with the texture. This is actually a good example of what you should not do. Sand it down properly first using PVC plastic sandpaper, basically, and then draw your freehand on top of it. It's better to spend 5 more minutes on doing that in the beginning process of preparing the miniature, rather than spending 2 hours trying to get a highlight right when you're working with so much texture. So yeah, freehand's worst enemy is texture in the model. It's still possible to pull off, but I think I get a little bit impatient here as well, I must admit. One thing I should mention, when you're painting like this, you can go on for quite a few hours in painting, and the consistency of all the paints that you put down on your palette will actually change while you are painting as well. And that has nothing to do with your wet palette and some products that may be a little bit better than others and whatnot. No, it's because water will always seep through the paper you are using and into your paint, which will cause thicker paints to become more runny. So say for instance that you were mixing a layer consistency paint. If you wait long enough, then that paint will change its properties and become more runny. Whereas if you are working with a glaze, the opposite actually happens. If you're mixing a glaze on a wet palette, which you actually shouldn't do, you should use a well palette. I just haven't bought one yet, but yeah, you should use a well palette. When you're using a glaze on a wet palette, instead of water seeping into the paint from underneath it, paint will, or water in the paint will seep into the water beneath it. So as you are painting, that glaze actually becomes more pigmented, which means that if you have a glaze worked to a perfect consistency, if you wait long enough and use and paint with the same glaze, you will start to create those brush marks on your model. And I think that's actually what's happening now on my model right now, on that vein. You can see how smooth the colors are on the lower tentacles, whereas on this tentacle that I'm working on right now, you can see the brush marks quite easily, and they are not as smooth. These are I'm not working with a glaze though, it's a layer, but they will also change their properties as you are painting with them. And depending on how much water you have in them, they will change differently. So basically the take-home message is that you have to pay attention to how your paints change their properties by the simple passing of time. Great, another thing you have to worry about. But yeah, if you're familiar with using a wet palette, I'm sure you have noticed that if you have gone on for longer painting periods. So now I'm applying the glaze for the shadows. It's interesting because when you first apply this glaze, you almost cannot see a difference. But as you continue to go over the same areas more than once, they will actually start to build up, and they will become quite visible. So right now I'm actually making a mistake. I'm not waiting for the paint to dry before I go over the same spot again. And what that will do is that you're pushing pigments in directions you don't want them. So you can actually see some coffee-like stains underneath the right tentacle there. And that's what happens if you do that. There are like some open spots where you don't see black paint, and then you suddenly see a line of black paint. It doesn't look nice, and that will have to be fixed, obviously. But yeah, there's a lot of texture here as well, which is also working against me. So yeah, trying to correct for this now, but I think it's too late. I think I have to go over with a base color to remove those nasty black lines that's under the last curve of the tentacle. So you can see how time consuming it is to actually try to fix those errors. I'm constantly trying to go over the same spot in order to obscure the mistake, but I think it's still visible to a degree in which I will have to fix it in another manner, and that is by going over with the base color. I still haven't fixed it here, but I think I will. Maybe not in this video. So the tentacle that goes over the eye will be the last tentacle that I paint. There are two more that are unpainted, but it's more of the same. So if you follow the whole painting process so far, you should be able to get the gist of it, basically, from here on out. When creating these fine lines in the veins, you should use a brush with a pointy tip. Because this particular tentacle is going over the eye, you want that to be brighter than all the other tentacles, because this is more situated towards you compared to the other tentacles. And one way to create that illusion is to add more of a brightness to the tentacle on the curve where it goes over the eye. So now I'm carefully adding the higher highlight points. And like I said, I've said before, this is not really about the colors, it's more about the technique. So you can replicate these veins by using any colors that you would like to use. It's just important that you, when you desaturate a color, also add maybe another color to keep it interesting. Because if you're only desaturating and desaturating with white, it tends to not look as interesting as it could. So yeah, that's one tip. And if you have a full cabinet of paints, you probably can just use 4 or 5 complementary colors, and you can go from there. Whereas I have to mix my own colors. Okay, so here it's actually quite interesting. I'm adding some white dots. They're not completely white, they're off-white, and that will draw attention towards those spots. Don't add too many of those because you will overwhelm the model, but for that particular tentacle, it looks nice there. Okay, so it's coming towards the end of the video now. Thank you so much for watching. I got more content coming soon, so yeah, I'll see you soon.